The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as William stood at the edge of the airfield, his military uniform pressed to perfection. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cap for the third time in as many minutes. Kate stood beside him, her navy dress fluttering gently in the breeze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Around them, hundreds of people had gathered, military personnel, officials, and members of the press, but in that moment, it felt as though they were the only two people in the world. William had received his deployment orders just 3 weeks earlier. 6 months in the Falklands with the Royal Air Force, serving as a search and rescue pilot. They had known this day would come eventually. Military service was part of his duty, part of who he was. But knowing something and facing it were two entirely different things. Kate had smiled bravely when he told her, had held his hand, and said she understood. But late at night, when she thought he was asleep, he had heard her crying softly into her pillow. The crowd around them maintained a respectful distance, understanding the gravity of the moment. Photographers lowered their cameras, choosing dignity over sensationalism. Even the usually bustling airfield seemed to have quieted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. William's commanding officer had given them these final moments together, knowing that duty would soon call him away from everything he held dear. Kate reached up to straighten William's collar, though it needed no adjustment. Her fingers lingered against the fabric, memorizing the feel of it, the warmth of him beneath. "You have everything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak just yet. In his pocket was her photograph, the one taken during their university days, both of them laughing at something long forgotten. He would carry it with him every day. Behind them, the aircraft engines began their warm-up sequence, the sound growing from a low hum to a steady roar. Other servicemen and women were saying their own goodbyes, embracing loved ones, whispering final words of love and reassurance. Children clung to parents, wives to husbands, families to sons and daughters. The air was thick with emotion, with a weight of separation that military families knew all too well. William's grandmother had spoken to him the night before, sharing her own memories of sending his grandfather off to war. "The waiting is the hardest part," she had said, her eyes distant with remembrance. "But love endures. It always endures." He had held those words close, would repeat them to Kate before he left. They would need them in the months ahead. The flight crew signaled that boarding would begin in 5 minutes. Around them, the crowd seemed to press closer, not physically, but emotionally. Everyone understood what these final moments meant. A mother nearby was smoothing her son's uniform repeatedly, unable to stop touching him. An elderly veteran stood at attention, remembering his own farewells decades ago. Even the toughest military personnel seemed to soften, allowing the humanity of the moment to show through. Kate's best friend stood 20 feet away, ready to offer support once William was gone. She had driven Kate to the airfield that morning, had sat quietly in the car as Kate stared out the window, trying to prepare herself for this moment. They had stopped for coffee, but neither had managed more than a sip. Some things were too big for ordinary rituals to make better. William pulled Kate close, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, the vanilla shampoo she always used. His arms wrapped around her, as if he could somehow take the feeling with him, pack away with his gear and uniforms. She pressed her face against his chest, and he felt the warmth of her tears through his shirt. Neither of them cared who was watching now. This was their moment, their goodbye. "I'll write every day," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "Every single day. I'll be waiting for every letter," she replied, managing a watery smile. "And I'll write back twice as much. You'll be so tired of reading about what I had for breakfast." He laughed, the sound catching in his throat. "Never. Tell me everything. Every tiny detail. I want to know it all." The final boarding call echoed across the tarmac. Other service members began moving toward the aircraft, their steps heavy with reluctance. William knew he had to go, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. How could he leave her? How could he walk away from the person who had become his whole world? Kate seemed to sense his struggle. She stepped back slightly, just enough to look up in his face. Her hands came up to frame his cheeks, and she rose up on her toes. Their kiss was tender, filled with all the words they couldn't say, all the promises they were making without speaking. Around them, the world blurred and faded. There was only this moment, only them. When they finally parted, both were crying openly. William didn't care about military protocol or maintaining composure. This was his wife, his love, his everything. And he was leaving her behind for half a year. 6 months of empty beds, of meals eaten alone, of celebrations missed, and sorrows unshared. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing. "Be safe," Kate whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, just be safe and come home to me." "Always," he promised. "You're my reason to come home. You're my everything." He began walking backward toward the plane, unwilling to turn away from her just yet. Their hands had been clasped, and as the distance grew, their fingers slowly slipped apart. The loss of contact felt like a physical blow. Kate pressed her hand to her heart, and he mirrored the gesture. Even from 10 feet away, he could see her lips moving, mouthing the words, "I love you." Other families were going through the same ritual of separation. The tarmac had become a tableau of human emotion, raw and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. Military discipline gave way to human need as couples embraced one last time, as parents held children they wouldn't see for months, as brave faces crumbled into honest tears. The aircraft stairs seemed impossibly steep as William climbed them. At the top, he turned one final time. Kate stood where he had left her, small and alone despite the crowd around her. She raised her hand in a wave, and he saw the sunlight catch on her wedding ring. He pressed his fingers to his lips, then held them out to her, sending his love across the distance between them. As he disappeared into the aircraft, Kate's friend moved quickly to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. But Kate stood tall, watching the plane, waiting. She would stand there until it took off, until she could no longer see it in the sky. It was what military wives did. They stood strong, they waited, and they loved fiercely across any distance. Inside the aircraft, William found his seat, his legs shaky. His fellow servicemen understood, offering silent nods of support. Many of them had left loved ones on the tarmac, too. The brotherhood of military service included understanding these moments of vulnerability, of recognizing that strength sometimes meant allowing yourself to feel. He pulled out Kate's photograph before the plane even began to taxi, needing to see her smile. 6 months, 183 days, 4,392 hours. He had calculated it obsessively, had counted down to this day with dread. Now he would count down to his return with hope. As the aircraft engines roared to life and the plane began to move, Kate remained steadfast on the tarmac. The crowd around her was thinning as other families began their journeys home to emptier houses. But she would wait until the very last moment. William knew she would. It was one of the countless things he loved about her, her strength, her loyalty, her ability to find grace even in the hardest moments. The plane turned at the end of the runway, engines building power for takeoff. Through his window, William could barely make out the cluster of people still watching. Somewhere in that group was Kate, standing vigil. He pressed his hand to the window, wishing she could feel it somehow, wishing love could travel through glass and air and space to touch her one more time. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, climbing steadily away from everything he held dear, William closed his eyes and held tight to his promise. He would come home. He would be safe. He would return to her arms and never take a single moment for granted again. Below him, growing smaller by the second, Kate watched until the plane became a speck in the sky, until even that disappeared. The goodbye was complete, but their love remained, stretching across continents and oceans, unbreakable and eternal. The world had watched them part, had shared in their sorrow and their strength. And now the waiting began. The house felt different without William's presence. Kate moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching objects that held his memory. His coffee mug still sat by the sink where he had left it that morning, unwashed because she couldn't bear to erase this small trace of him. His pillow still carried the indent of his head, and she found herself sleeping on his side of the bed, wrapped in one of his old rugby shirts that smelled faintly of his cologne. The first letter arrived a week after his departure. Kate's hands shook as she opened it, tears blurring her vision before she even read the first word. His handwriting, slightly messier than usual due to the cramped writing conditions on base, filled 3 pages. He described his journey, the other men in his unit, the strange beauty of the Falklands landscape. But mostly, he wrote about missing her, about the ache of separation that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. She wrote back immediately, filling page after page with the mundane details of her life that he had requested. The way the garden was beginning to bloom, the new recipe she had tried and failed spectacularly, the movie she had watched while wrapped in his blanket. She pressed a drop of her perfume to the paper before sealing it, wanting to send some small part of herself across the ocean to him. Their correspondence became a lifeline. Letters crossed in the mail, creating a continuous conversation that spanned weeks. William wrote about the dangerous rescue missions, the lives saved, the close calls that he downplayed, but that Kate read between the lines. She wrote about the charity work that kept her busy, the long walks she took when missing him became too much to bear indoors, the way she talked to his photograph every night before bed. 3 months into the deployment, the loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. Military wives reached out, creating a network of support that Kate hadn't known she needed. They met for coffee, shared stories, held each other up during the hardest moments. One woman, whose husband had been deployed 6 times, became particularly close to Kate. "The first deployment is the hardest," she said gently. "But you learn that love doesn't diminish with distance. If anything, it grows stronger." William, too, was struggling. The physical demands of his job kept him busy during the day, but at night, when the base grew quiet, the separation hit hardest. He had taped Kate's photograph inside his locker, and his fellow pilots had learned not to comment on the way he traced her face with his finger before each mission. They all had their own photographs, their own rituals for staying connected across the miles. One particularly difficult night, after a mission had gone wrong, and they had lost someone, William sat outside under the vast Falkland sky and wrote to Kate about fear. Not the fear of flying or of danger, but the fear of not making a home to her. It was his most honest letter, raw with emotion and vulnerability. When Kate received it 2 weeks later, she cried for an hour, then wrote back with her own fears and promises that their love would see them through anything. The seasons began to change back home. Kate marked the passing time with photographs sent in her letters. The garden in full bloom, the first autumn leaves, the way frost painted patterns on their kitchen window. William saved every photo, creating a visual diary of the life he was missing, but would return to. His bunkmates teased him good-naturedly about the growing collection, but many of them had similar shrines to home. News of William's heroic rescue missions began to filter back home. Kate would hear about them through official channels days after they happened, her heart stopping each time the phone rang with an unfamiliar number. But William always found a way to let her know he was safe, even if it was just a brief message passed through military channels. "Still breathing, still loving you," became his standard check-in, and Kate treasured those 5 words more than any poetry. On their wedding anniversary, 4 months into the deployment, William managed to arrange a satellite phone call. The connection was poor, filled with static and delays, but the sound of each other's voices after months of written words was overwhelming. They both cried, laughed, cried again. Kate described the dinner she had cooked, his favorite meal, and eaten alone at their dining table with his photograph propped against his empty plate. William told her about the cake his unit had somehow procured, how they had toasted Kate with terrible military coffee in tin cups. The call lasted only 15 minutes before the connection failed, but those minutes sustained them both for weeks afterward. Kate played the conversation over in her mind, remembering every word, every pause, every crackle of static that had carried his voice across thousands of miles. William did the same, holding on to the memory of her laugh, the way she had said his name, the love that had traveled clearly despite the poor connection. As the deployment entered its final months, anticipation began to build. Kate started planning his homecoming, then stopped herself, afraid to jinx it. Other military wives shared their superstitions and rituals. Some cleaned obsessively. Others refused to mark calendars. Most simply held their breath and waited. Kate found herself doing all of these things, swinging between excitement and anxiety as the days slowly counted down. William's letters became more frequent as the end approached, filled with plans for their reunion and promises of never taking their time together for granted again. He wrote about the lessons learned, the ways the separation had changed him, made him more grateful for the life they had built together. Kate wrote back with her own revelations, the strength she had found, the independence she had developed while still longing for their partnership to resume. 2 weeks before his scheduled return, bad weather grounded all flights from the Falklands. William's homecoming was delayed indefinitely, and Kate felt the disappointment like a physical blow. She had been counting days, had allowed herself to imagine their reunion, and now the uncertainty was almost unbearable. But she did what military spouses do. She adapted, she waited, she continued to hope. When the weather finally cleared and William's return was confirmed, Kate could barely contain herself. She stood in front of her closet for an hour, trying to decide what to wear, laughing at herself for caring about something so trivial when all that mattered was seeing him again. In the end, she chose the blue dress she had worn when they got engaged, wanting him to see that some things hadn't changed, that she was still the woman he had left behind 6 months ago, just stronger now. The morning of his return dawned cold and clear. Kate arrived at the airfield 3 hours early, unable to stay home any longer. Other families began to gather, the same mixture of excitement and anxiety on every face. Children held homemade welcome signs, wives touched up lipstick with shaking hands, parents stood proud and nervous. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. When the aircraft finally appeared on the horizon, a cheer went up from the crowd. Kate's heart hammered in her chest as she watched it descend, as the wheels touched down, as it taxied toward them with agonizing slowness. She could see faces in the windows, but couldn't make out William among them. Her hands clenched and unclenched, her whole body trembling with the need to see him, to touch him, to confirm that he was really home. The aircraft door opened, and servicemen and women began to emerge. Each reunion was a celebration. Children launching themselves at parents, couples falling into each other's arms, families made whole again. Kate searched frantically for William's face, and then, suddenly, there he was, thinner than when he left, his face bronzed by the Falklands sun, but unmistakably, wonderfully him. Their eyes met across the tarmac, and the rest of the world ceased to exist. Kate broke into a run, not caring about dignity or decorum. William dropped his bag and met her halfway, catching her as she threw herself into his arms. They held each other so tightly it hurt, but neither wanted to let go. 6 months of separation, of letters and longing dissolved in that embrace. "You're home," Kate whispered against his neck, breathing him in, assuring herself he was real. "You're really home." "I'm home," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm home, my love. I'm home." They stood there on the tarmac, holding each other as life streamed around them. Other reunions played out nearby, the air filled with joy and tears and the indescribable relief of families reunited. But for William and Kate, there was only each other, only this moment they had waited 6 months to reach. When they finally pulled apart enough to look at each other, both were crying and laughing simultaneously. Kate traced the new lines on his face, the evidence of sun and stress, and time passed. William tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with infinite tenderness, marveling that he could touch her again, that the distance between them had shrunk from thousands of miles to nothing at all. "Never again," Kate said firmly. "I'm never letting you go that far from me again." William laughed, the sound fuller and freer than it had been in months. "I'm perfectly happy to stay exactly where you are for the rest of my life," he agreed. "No more goodbyes. I've had enough goodbyes to last a lifetime." They walked off the tarmac hand in hand, fingers interlaced so tightly it would take significant force to separate them. William's bag remained forgotten on the ground until a helpful serviceman brought it to them, understanding the priorities of the moment. As they passed other reunited families, there were nods of understanding, smiles of shared joy. They had all survived the separation. They had all found their way back to each other. In the car, Kate couldn't stop touching William, his hand, his face, his shoulder, needing the constant reassurance of his presence. He understood, keeping one hand always in contact with her even as he tried to take in the familiar sights of home. Everything looked the same, but different, filtered through 6 months of absence that made even mundane things seem precious. "Tell me everything," he said as they drove. "Every single thing I missed. Start from the minute I left, and don't stop until we're caught up." Kate laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. "That could take weeks," she warned. "I have time," William replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "I have all the time in the world now." As they pulled into their driveway, William saw the yellow ribbons Kate had tied around the trees, the welcome home banner their neighbors had hung. His throat tightened with emotion at these signs of love and support. He was home, really, truly home. The months of separation already felt like a distant dream, something that had happened to other people in another life. Inside the house, everything was exactly as he remembered, but somehow more precious. His coffee mug by the sink made him smile. The photographs on the mantel seemed brighter. Even the creaky step on the stairs sounded like music. Kate watched him rediscover their life, understanding his need to touch everything, to reacquaint himself with the physical reality of home. That night, as they lay entwined in their bed, both afraid to sleep and lose even a moment together, they talked about the future, about the lessons learned, the strength found, the love that had endured and grown despite the distance. The world had watched them say goodbye 6 months ago, had witnessed their pain and separation. Now, in the privacy of their home, they celebrated their reunion, their survival, their unbreakable bond. "Thank you for waiting," William whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for coming home," Kate whispered back. Outside, the world continued its relentless spin, full of separations and reunions of hellos and goodbyes. But inside their home, time stood still. They were together again, and that was all that mattered. The goodbye that had broken their hearts had led to a homecoming that healed them, stronger and more grateful than before. Love had endured. Love had conquered. Love had brought them home.